The theory of evolution has done well explaining the world we live in. Mostly, the only people that find a reason to dispute the evidence of evolution are ones who have a bias they are not aware of and or not willing to change. I have found myself questioning one of the pillars of evolution because I noticed just how many organisms have adaptations too specific to their exact circumstances. I found this frequency of specificity to be beyond the believability of coincidences based on undirected mutations. This led me to spending years researching and thinking about the problem. I eventually found enough pieces to the puzzle to give an educated guess about why nature is this way. My educated guess is based on only materialistic aspects, just like all other scientific hypotheses. My proposed mechanism for genetic changes is theoretical at this point, so the people that only care about experimental evidence will need to wait until those experiments happen. Some people seem to not understand that science does not only involve experimental data. There are 3 pillars of evolution that mechanisms of evolution adhere to. Natural selection is the strongest pillar of evolution. I have not heard of anyone trying to argue against it. It would be pretty silly for someone to argue that the fittest members of a species don't have a higher chance to pass on their genes through reproductive success. The idea of common descent is a controversial pillar of evolution. There is too much evidence of this aspect of evolution for any meaningful changes to be made easily. The best defense against this pillar is to pretend it is not as strong as it is or quibble over gaps in the data. These gaps are to be expected since the evidence partly relies on the relatively rare process of fossilization. However, these gaps do nothing to weaken the evidence that has already been gathered and analyzed. Logic is likely not going to affect the argument concerning this pillar because it impacts the worldview for various groups of people. Logic is no match against ingrained aspects of a person's identity. This means a person having the ability to objectively consider the validity of evidence that could threaten the foundation of their identity is highly unlikely to happen. I think people that want to disprove, debunk, or dismiss evolution focus on this pillar because it is perceived as the weak link. I strongly disagree with this idea because this pillar keeps getting strengthened by a steady influx of corroborating evidence. This makes it difficult as time goes on to keep up with the diminished number of gaps. The third pillar involves the genetic changes happening over time that are tested by the environment through the process of natural selection. I would argue that Darwinian evolutionists react the same way to this pillar as creationists react to the common descent pillar. This is understandable since it is a slippery slope they are on. If they admit the existence of genetic changes being caused by a purposeful process, then they risk looking unscientific. This is because they are so used to purpose being in the domain of proponents for intelligent design and creationists. They can't admit even to themselves that genetic changes might not be undirected even when they see evidence to the contrary. The false dichotomy of trusting in current scientific understandings and invoking a supernatural force makes my job of introducing a new idea to this pillar a difficult endeavor indeed. My idea of purposeful evolution only involves aspects of science that have already been confirmed. The only aspect in dispute is whether these confirmed aspects of science have anything to do with the emergence of genetic changes. This is good because there is already evidence showing my proposed mechanism to be true, but it is also possible to detect future instances in nature and test for in a lab. I have seen people pointing out instances of evolution happening more rapidly than expected. This is highly suspect given this pillar is thought to involve a blind process of gradual changes. The way I usually see this conflicting evidence concerning this pillar dealt with is shifting the onus to the natural selection pillar. This allows people to bring up the idea of rapid evolution happening because of a selective pressure in the environment. Not only does the idea of mutations happening in this manner contradict an undirected process, but natural selection can't test a mutation until it has already emerged. It is impossible for undirected mutations to be affected by even the smallest degree, even if the organism is in an environment with the biggest selective pressure that has ever existed. Yet scientists seem to ignore this fact just like creationists seem to ignore any evidence threatening their worldview. Note that this contradiction does not apply to natural selection impacting a population that already has the mutations for the environment to test. This video provides an example of rapid evolution.
Researchers are looking for adaptations in people who spend a lot of time underwater. The Bajo people, also known sometimes as the sea nomads, have spent thousands of years diving deep underwater without tanks or snorkels. Bajo divers may spend as much as 60% of their workday under the surface, spearing fish and harvesting sea cucumbers. Researchers in this study found that the Bajo have spleens that are 50% larger than their land-based neighbors. It's possible that these larger spleens may serve as a reservoir for extra oxygenated blood needed for long, breathless dives. The researchers then looked to see if there was a genetic component. They wanted to know if big spleens are inherited or if there was something else going on. After comparing the Bajo DNA with DNA from nearby farmers and from Han Chinese, the team found 25 genes that were different in the Bajo. One notable difference was in a gene called PDE10A. Other researchers have found that in mice, this gene can affect thyroid activity, which in turn affects spleen size. While it's unlikely one gene is responsible for the size of the spleen, the research strongly suggests that there is a genetic component to this spleen enlargement. And it also shows, whether it's high altitude living or the deep diving life, humans have adapted to low oxygen environments in a number of different ways throughout history.
The idea of blind evolution causing the appropriate mutation for this exact environmental factor should be far beyond believable coincidences if mutations occur through an undirected process. It is usually thought that a beneficial mutation can take millions of years, yet it has happened in this population in the span of thousands of years. This is just one example of rapid evolution occurring despite involving very specific environmental conditions. It is usually just accepted that people that dive would of course adapt to diving. I mean, isn't that what natural selection does? This is definitely not what natural selection does, since natural selection has no influence for the emergence of genetic changes it is testing through reproductive success. This is why it is time to consider the idea of mutations not being as random as they are expected to be if they are caused by an undirected process. I will be focusing on providing videos with more examples of evolution that seem to have occurred rapidly. This evidence will show the likelihood of not all mutations being caused by an undirected process. I am not claiming that only purposeful mutations occur. Also, an organism is not pulling up a menu of adaptations and mutating exactly in the way it needs to. A purposeful process of mutations emerging based on environmental factors happens through an increased rate of mutations rather than the minimal number of mutations needed. Purposeful evolution is not a magic bullet that makes an organism fully adapted to its environment. This is literally impossible because some organisms would always be at a disadvantage. For example, if an organism's prey is faster, then this becomes an instance in which purposeful evolution could help. On the other hand, the prey being slower is also an instance in which purposeful evolution could help the prey. There will never be a perfect harmony because there are conflicting environmental pressures. This means purposeful evolution is an ongoing process. This also explains why some evolutionary arms races have caused such high degrees of specificity. This is especially evident when an organism has venom that its prey has the exact resistance against. Imagine, if you will, an organism becoming more and more resistant to the exact increasingly toxic venom it needs protection against, even though mutations are caused by an undirected process.